Mr. President, we all know that the Obama administration's 8 years in office are beginning to wind down. And as it does, as is natural for a president ending his time in office, the president and members of his team are starting to focus on their legacy and how they want to be remembered. Now, with regard to this administration's policies in the Middle East, unfortunately for them, a legacy and a narrative that is beginning to take hold is one of not leveling with the American people, not one of honesty. And that should concern all of us in this body, whether Democrats or Republicans. When the President of the United States is in open disagreement with the Secretary of Defense, with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on one of the most critical issues our nation faces, whether to send our sons and daughters into combat, it should be cause for significant concern for all of us, in this body and across the country. Now, President Obama has repeatedly told the American people that U.S. troops in the Middle East are not in combat. In 2010, he announced that we are, quote, ending our combat mission in Iraq. In 2014, he used the same words to talk about Afghanistan. And more recently, he said that our mission in Syria, quote, will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. Yet, just less than 2 weeks ago, in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, when the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, were asked if our troops in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, are engaged in combat, these two senior U.S. officials unequivocally said, yes, they are. Now, to members of our military serving overseas, particularly in the Middle East, Secretary Carter and General Dunford were stating the obvious. Indeed, there's been recent news reports in the Washington Post and the Military Times that describe up to 200 Marines at a place called Fire Base Bell in northern Iraq firing artillery missions on a daily basis in support of Iraqi troops in order to kill ISIS terrorists. Our soldiers serving in the Middle East as part of the Joint Special Operations Command conduct regular missions, counterterrorism missions, to kill and capture terrorists in the Middle East. And of course, we see it on a daily basis. Our brave pilots from all the different services have dropped approximately 40,000 bombs in Iraq and Syria in close air support missions, again, focus on destroying and killing ISIS members and their infrastructure and their logistics bases. Since 2014, almost 1,200 bombs and close air support missions have been conducted in Afghanistan. And just yesterday, we were informed of a successful strike, again, coalition strike, with fighter aircraft that killed 3 ISIS leaders. Mr. President, as you know, these missions have entailed risk. Some of our members of the military have been killed. Others have been wounded. But there's no doubt that all of what I just described is the very definition of combat. Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs have all stated this. And indeed, in a lead editorial in the Military Times just on Friday that was titled, "It's Combat, Mr. President," the editorial concluded by saying, when U.S. and allied troops are on Islamic State turf with the mission of wiping it from existence, which is their mission, they are on a combat mission. Calling it anything else is wrong. Now, to Secretary Carter's credit, again, just at a hearing last week, he agreed and stated unequivocally, these members of our military are in combat, and I think we need to say that clearly. This is the Secretary of Defense. Well, apparently the White House didn't get the memo. Just last week, when asked about a very brave Navy SEAL who unfortunately was killed in a fierce firefight involving U.S. Special Operations Forces, Kurdish commandos, and Islamic State fighters, White House spokesman Josh Earnest told reporters that, quote, the relatively small number of U.S. service members that are involved in these operations are not in combat, but in a dangerous place, unquote. So that's the White House. Relatively small, not in combat. So why does President Obama and his White House continue to peddle the fiction that U.S. forces are not engaged in combat? That's a really important question that we need to be asking. Why? The whole world knows that we are. Why are they peddling this fiction to the American people? Perhaps the Commander-in-Chief is truly unaware that our military forces are in combat, and there's hundreds of them that are. If that's the case, that would be very, very troubling indeed. What's more likely is that the President has told the American people repeatedly that he will end wars and won't send combat troops to the Middle East, and so the word contortions coming from the White House are part of a twisted attempt to salvage and protect the President's legacy. But by spinning the truth for political purposes, the President is coming perilously close to leaving a legacy of dishonesty when it comes to our military involvement in the Middle East. And much more worrisome, Mr. President, is that this dishonesty comes with costs. First and foremost, it diminishes the service and sacrifice of our troops and their families. Again, in the Military Times editorial on this very topic, just on Friday, it stated, calling it a training mission in the Middle East is cold comfort to the parents, spouses, and children of the deployed troops. The more the White House insists that these troops are not part of a combat mission, the more distrust it breeds in the ranks of our military and among the public. It's viewed as a sort of condescending semantics Washington plays to deny the obvious that can only serve to erode support for the important mission. Americans serving in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan know that they're in combat. The Commander-in-Chief needs to acknowledge this fact and the bravery it entails, not disguise the true nature of their duty. Second, the costs that come with this dishonesty are that it further undermines the administration's very tenuous foreign policy credibility regarding its stated goal of degrading and destroying ISIS. While this is the correct goal, a series of missteps in the Middle East, including the President's failure to enforce his own red line when it was crossed by Bashar al-Assad in Syria, have brought us to the point where our adversaries and our allies question U.S. credibility and resolve. Islamic State terrorists know that they're in combat against American forces. They see it every day. But when the President says otherwise, it signals a lack of conviction, making it harder for us to defeat these terrorists. Third, this dishonesty about the role of our troops allows presidential candidates to duck a tough issue. For example, presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has repeatedly said, unchallenged by anyone, including in the media, that she would continue the president's policies of not sending combat troops to Syria and Iraq. But the president is sending combat troops to Syria and Iraq. Finally, Mr. President, and more broadly, by playing fast and loose with the facts about our policies in the Middle East, the Obama administration is making it harder to gain congressional support for its policies. Now, I strongly believe that when the executive branch and the legislative branch on national security and foreign policy issues are in agreement and working together, that's when we are most strong as a country. I've been critical of this administration's policies in certain areas and supportive in others. But if Congress feels like the administration is being played and the American public are not giving the courtesy of the truth, support in this body for these important policies will crumble. And Mr. President, we saw an extreme example of this over the weekend in a remarkable New York Times Magazine piece about the president's deputy national security advisor, who was credited with selling the Iran nuclear deal to Congress and the American people. We see line after line in this very lengthy article about not leveling with the American people on that deal, which we debated here on the Senate floor. Let me give you a couple quotes from that article. One is just how they sold the deal. Now I'm quoting the article. The way in which most Americans have heard the story of the Iran deal presented, that the Obama administration began seriously engaging with Iranian officials in 2013 in order to take advantage of a new political reality in Iran, which came about in 2013 because of elections that brought moderates to power, was largely manufactured by the White House for the purpose of selling the Iran deal. Unquote. So here we have White House officials saying they manufactured a story to sell the nuclear deal to the Congress and the American people. Another quote talked about a speech that the president gave on the deal, a very important speech, and it says, quote, while the president's statement and speech was technically accurate, and this was about the timing of the negotiations, it was also actively misleading. So again, top White House official pretty much admitting that he was fabricating a narrative to get the American people and the Congress of the United States to, quote, sell and buy off on the Iran deal. You know, Mr. President, reading this article, one gets the sense that to some of the people in the White House, this is all a game. Facts don't matter, but cleverness does. The quotes in this article from young White House officials are almost gleeful when they recount how they sold the nuclear deal to, quote, clueless reporters. Any of the press listening, I hope you like that adjective, and members of Congress. How the White House created a, quote, echo chamber and were the puppet masters, literally putting words in the mouths of members of Congress and reporters to sell this deal. My colleagues should read this article. Again, it's like a game. But of course, this is not a game. All of this, American troops in combat, whether the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism should obtain a nuclear weapon, this is not a game. This is a deadly serious reality. And I was reminded of this serious reality this past week when I spent much of my recess with the assessment and selection team of the Marine Corps Special Operations Command. It wasn't clever 30-somethings with fine arts degrees out in the field working on little sleep, but 20-somethings of all backgrounds from every corner of America going through some of the most rigorous military training possible. Some of these young Marines will make the cut for Special Operations Command, others won't. But all are striving for the honor of defending their nation during challenging times. No doubt, in due time, many will be heading downrange to the Middle East and other parts of the world, doing their duty to keep us safe. The Obama administration owes these brave young Americans the truth, not spin. The Obama administration owes Congress the truth, not spin. And the Obama administration certainly owes the American people the truth, not spin. The sooner the president and his White House start leveling with the American people about our roles and our policies in the Middle East, the better it will be for all of us. Mr. President, I yield the floor.